The morning sunlight streamed through the high-rise windows of Parker and Finch, casting a bright glow across stacks of case files scattered on Lana Adams's desk. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself for the mountain of paperwork she'd been assigned that day. It was only her second year as a paralegal, but she'd earned a reputation for handling high-pressure cases with precision and grace. Her resilience, though hidden to most, had been carved out of years of moving from one foster home to another. Each new placement, each goodbye, had only strengthened her resolve to build something lasting. A life free from the control of anyone else. Today's assignment, however, was different. This case file, neatly labelled Marshall v. Marshall, held a peculiar weight. The name Marshall was well known throughout the city, synonymous with wealth, influence and, at least in the public's eyes, power. Robert and Evelyn Marshall were at the centre of an intense legal battle with their niece, Samantha. Rumours of fraud, betrayal and family secrets had swelled in the media for weeks, making it one of the most high-profile cases Lana had ever worked on. As she flipped through pages of background documents, her curiosity grew. She'd handled estate disputes before, but there was something about this case that stirred an inexplicable sense of familiarity within her. Lana was meticulous, and it was this attention to detail that led her to notice the small, seemingly insignificant document slipped between pages in the file. It was an old birth certificate. The name on it had been blurred, as though it had been photocopied too many times, but she could just make out the faint letters. Baby girl Marshall. She paused, staring at the paper for a moment. A prickle of unease crept over her. Why would an old birth certificate be in the middle of a high-stakes fraud case? She scanned further, noticing other documents that hinted at a hidden chapter in the Marshall family history. A baby that had been born, then quietly erased from records, her existence acknowledged only in these fragile pieces of paper. Unable to shake the feeling, she picked up another document, a faded newspaper clipping from over 2 decades ago. The headline read, "Prominent family welcomes newborn daughter amidst tragic loss." Lana's mind raced, the pieces beginning to connect in unsettling ways. Who realized the article was dated around the time she herself had been born. A shiver ran down her spine. Her own background was a mystery. She had few details of her biological parents, and no records of her life before her first foster home. Growing up, she'd been told she was given up shortly after birth, but no one had ever been able to provide her with any further information. She'd learned to bury that part of her life, to stop asking questions that never had answers. Yet, as she looked at the date on the newspaper clipping, her resolve began to crack. Could this be a coincidence? The idea seemed absurd. The Marshalls were a prominent family. If they'd had another child, why would they abandon her? And if she was that child, why had she been lost to the foster care system? The questions swirled, each one filling her with a deeper sense of unease. Lana shook her head, pushing the unlikely notion out of her mind. She needed to focus on the case. But as she tried to go back to the documents, her concentration wavered. She couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that there was something personal hidden in these pages. Determined to gain some clarity, Lana began digging through the Marshall family's financial records, inheritance details and emails. She skimmed over years of transactions, charitable donations and corporate mergers, her fingers moving methodically across her keyboard. But every few pages, she would find something strange, a hint that the Marshalls might have kept secrets even darker than the ones on public record. Her mind buzzed with questions, but she reminded herself that she was there to work, not investigate her own past. The Marshalls were known for their guarded privacy, and the last thing she wanted was to jeopardize her job by chasing shadows. Yet, something kept pulling her in. An inexplicable connection, an invisible thread that linked her to this family in ways she couldn't explain. As the day wore on, Lana's curiosity grew stronger. She decided to take a risk. She ran a quick search in the firm's confidential database for her own name alongside the Marshall case, hoping for nothing more than a confirmation that she was imagining things. But instead of nothing, the database flashed back a single hit. Lana Marie Marshall. Her heart pounded as she clicked on the record, and the screen filled with fragmented information. a sealed adoption file, a note about a closed family court case, and one single detail that took her breath away. Her birth parents' names were listed as Robert and Evelyn Marshall. Lorna's world shattered in that moment, the office around her fading into the background as she tried to comprehend the truth. She was a Marshall. The people she'd spent her life unknowingly resenting were the very same people she was now working against in court. She closed the files quickly, feeling exposed, as if the walls themselves might be watching. How could this be real? Every instinct told her to run, but the case, and her connection to it, held her rooted to the spot. She felt both drawn to and repelled by the idea that she was a part of this world, the one she'd read about only in headlines and seen from a distance. That night, Lana went home, her mind racing. She lay awake, the pieces of her past and present swirling together. She thought of the families she'd lived with, the nights spent wondering about who she truly was, and the cruel irony of finding her answers in a courtroom where she'd been nothing more than an unknowing pawn. In the days that followed, Lana grew more guarded, determined to protect her discovery. She would get to the bottom of this, but she needed to be careful. Her employers couldn't know the truth, and neither could the Marshalls. Not yet. But as Lana began to unravel the layers of her past, she realized that stepping into the courtroom meant stepping into her own history. A history that would force her to confront not just her family, but the darkest truths about herself. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as people shuffled to find their seats. Reporters murmured along the back row, and the steady hum of whispered conversations filled the space. Lana slipped into her assigned seat at the Parker and Finch table, clutching her pen tightly as she scanned the room. Her gaze landed on the Marshalls, Robert and Evelyn, sitting across from their niece, Samantha, who looked both defiant and wounded. Seeing them together stirred a rush of emotion she wasn't prepared to face. Despite the composed expression she'd practiced, a wave of unsettling déjà vu swept over her. It wasn't as though she remembered the Marshalls, yet something hauntingly familiar lingered in their presence. Robert's rigid posture, Evelyn's reserved demeanour. It was as if she recognized their unspoken communication, the way they conveyed thoughts without words. This uncanny familiarity left her both unsettled and intrigued, reminding her that this case was more than just work. As the judge entered and called the court to order, the Marshall family drama unfolded before her, conveyed both in words and in the subtle glances exchanged across the room. Samantha's attorney began with a powerful opening statement, painting a vivid scene of betrayal and mistrust, describing the family tensions and hidden agreements. He detailed how Samantha had invested years in the family business, only to find herself cast aside, her inheritance quietly taken by her aunt and uncle, who aimed to maintain control at any cost. Lana's gaze darted between Samantha and her estranged aunt and uncle, her heart racing as if she were the one on trial. Samantha's eyes, narrowed and fierce with resentment, seemed to pierce through Robert and Evelyn, demanding answers they refused to provide. This wasn't just a corporate dispute, it was a deeply personal vendetta, and Lana couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow tied to it, like a ghost lingering just outside the walls of a home she once knew. As the day's testimonies continued, Lana tried to focus on her notes, but her mind kept drifting. She found herself analysing Robert and Evelyn's every movement, searching for some clue to explain the sense of familiarity gnawing at her. It was maddening, as though her own memories were hidden just out of reach, teasing her with the possibility of a connection she feared to confirm. Then, during a pause between testimonies, Samantha's attorney introduced a shocking new dimension to the case, a reference to a missing child within the Marshall family. Lana's heart raced, her pen pausing mid-sentence as she listened. Samantha's attorney spoke cautiously, almost reluctantly, as if this piece of information had been hidden under layers of secrecy for years. According to him, a child had been born into the Marshall family nearly 25 years ago, but for unknown reasons she had been quietly removed from the family records and was rumoured to have vanished from their lives. Lana's breath caught in her throat. She'd come across hints of this in her own research, but had dismissed them, unable to believe that she could be that child. Hearing it spoken aloud in court felt like a strange confirmation, as though the pieces of her identity were falling into place. Could it really be true? Could she, Lana Adams, be the lost Marshall child? She struggled to keep her composure, but her mind was racing. How could Robert and Evelyn sit there, expressionless, as though this child's existence, or disappearance, meant nothing to them? She watched them closely, searching for any sign of remorse or pain, but there was none. They looked as indifferent as they had since the trial began, as if this were just another legal hurdle to overcome. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Lana's inner turmoil grew with each testimony, each revelation of the marshal's betrayal, of Samantha mirroring her own feelings of abandonment. She listened as Samantha described growing up in a family shaped by power plays and manipulation, where loyalty was conditional and affection was something to be exchanged. Every word Samantha spoke struck a chord with Lana, reminding her of all the times she'd questioned why she, too, had been left behind. After the court session, Lana lingered in the hallway, unable to leave just yet. She felt unsteady, as though the very ground beneath her was shifting. She leaned against a cold marble pillar, taking slow, steady breaths to calm herself. The truth was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotion she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. Just then she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up to see Samantha herself, walking down the corridor toward her, her expression unreadable. Samantha stopped a few feet away, studying Lana with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "You're with Parker and Finch, right?" Samantha asked, her tone casual yet cautious. Lana nodded, forcing herself to meet Samantha's gaze. "Yes, I'm one of the paralegals working on your case." Samantha tilted her head, a faint smirk on her lips. "You don't look like the usual paralegals they send. You seem different." The comment hung in the air, layered with implications Lana couldn't quite grasp. She wanted to ask Samantha if she'd ever heard of the missing child, if she'd ever wondered what had happened to her. But the words lodged in her throat, tangled with doubt and fear. Samantha's gaze softened slightly, as though she sensed Lana's internal struggle. "Family secrets," she said, almost to herself. "They have a way of following us, don't they?" Before Lana could respond, Samantha turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the empty hallway. The encounter left Lana shaken, as though Samantha had seen something within her that she wasn't ready to confront. She realized with a sinking feeling that this case was more complex than she'd anticipated. It wasn't just about the marshals or even Samantha's betrayal. It was about her own identity, her place within this web of family secrets. That night, Lana returned to her apartment and looked at the birth certificate she'd found, her fingers tracing the faded ink of her name. Lana Marie Marshall. The name felt foreign, yet strangely fitting, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She knew that in the days to come, she would have to face the truth, no matter how painful or complicated it might be. For now, though, she was just Lana Adams, the girl who had survived foster homes and loneliness, who had built a life from the ground up. She would need that strength more than ever as she unraveled the mystery of her own existence, confronting the parents who had abandoned her and the family that had erased her. And as the courtroom drama continued, she knew that her role was no longer purely professional. This was personal, deeply, undeniably personal. The next day, she walked into court with a renewed sense of determination, her heart pounding as she prepared to face the marshals once again. The truth awaited her, and she would uncover it, piece by painful piece, even if it shattered her world all over again. The dim glow from Lana's desk lamp cast long shadows across her apartment, mirroring the darkness she felt within. It was well past midnight, but she couldn't sleep, not with the relentless questions circling her mind. The revelations in court had set off a storm within her, and the pieces of the puzzle were scattered in every direction. All she knew was that her connection to the Marshall family was no coincidence. There was a history here, one she could no longer ignore. Determined to find answers, Lana opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing Lana Adams adoption records into the search bar. She'd tried this search before over the years, hitting dead ends each time. She'd always assumed her records were either lost in the foster care system or sealed beyond her reach. But tonight, she was resolute. She needed to know where she came from, and, more importantly, why she'd been abandoned. After several attempts, she stumbled upon a link she hadn't noticed before, a state database for sealed adoption files. As a paralegal, she knew the process would require official requests and legal permissions. But desperation overpowered caution, and she found herself bypassing security measures. Her heart pounded as she navigated the database, each click bringing her closer to the truth. And then, as if by some cosmic twist of fate, she found her file. It was sealed, marked with a code indicating restricted access, but there was a small loophole. It allowed her to view a single document. Her birth certificate. Lana's fingers trembled as she clicked the link, and a scanned image appeared on her screen. She stared at it, unable to believe what she was seeing. There, in faded ink, were the names she'd spent her life searching for. Name of child? Lana Marie Marshall. Parents, Robert and Evelyn Marshall. A shaky breath escaped her lips, sounding foreign in the silence of the room. She felt as though she were outside of herself, watching as the life she'd carefully built crumbled in an instant. Robert and Evelyn Marshall weren't just strangers embroiled in a legal battle. They were her parents, her own flesh and blood. Shock gave way to a rising tide of anger. Lana could barely grasp the implications. She had been representing her own parents, the people who had abandoned her, in a legal battle steeped in betrayal.
And they'd sat in court mere feet away without a single sign of recognition or remorse. It was as though she were invisible to them, an unwanted chapter of their lives discarded years ago. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away, feeling a surge of defiance. She'd grown up without them, had learned to be strong on her own, yet the undeniable truth of her abandonment clawed at her, ripping open old wounds she hadn't realized were still raw. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, rage, sorrow, curiosity, and a deep ache born from a lifetime of not knowing. Sitting in the darkness, Lana felt a powerful urge to confront the past. She wanted answers. Why had they left her? Why had they erased her from their lives? And why, even now, were they content to pretend she didn't exist? She grabbed a nearby notebook and began writing down questions as they came to her, each one more painful than the last. Why was I abandoned? Did they ever look for me? Does Samantha know about me? Would they still deny me if they knew who I was? The questions filled the page, but there were no answers. Her hand clenched, crumpling the paper slightly as she fought to contain the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Lana knew she couldn't let her discovery interfere with her work. The case required her focus, her skill, and her professionalism. But how could she look at Robert and Evelyn, knowing they were her parents, the very people who had left her to grow up alone? Her life had been a patchwork of struggles, endless moves from one foster home to another, countless sleepless nights wondering if she was somehow unworthy of love, and years spent building a life she could finally call her own. And yet, in a single moment, those years felt fragile, built on the foundation of lies and unanswered questions. As dawn broke, Lana was still awake, her face drawn and her eyes red from hours of contemplation. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, caught between the urge to confront the Marshalls and the fear of what she might discover. The only thing she knew for certain was that she could no longer pretend this case was just a job. It was her life, her story, and she needed to take control of it. The next morning she arrived at Parker and Finch, exhausted but resolute. She went through the motions, responding to emails, reviewing documents, but her thoughts were elsewhere. As she sat in her office, she began pulling together every piece of information she had on the Marshalls, piecing together a timeline of events. She needed to understand them, to find some reason, however twisted, that might explain why they'd left her. She learned that Robert and Evelyn had once been a prominent couple, the epitome of success and grace. They'd married young, each of them products of affluent families, and together they had built a reputation that stretched far beyond the city. But somewhere along the way, something had fractured. The whispers of a missing child had existed only in rumors, carefully buried beneath layers of family secrets. No one in the public eye had questioned the absence of an heir. It was as if the world had conspired to erase her from existence. Lana felt like an outsider peering into the private world of people who had chosen to forget her. She stared at a photograph of Robert and Evelyn, taken years ago at a charity gala. They looked like strangers, yet there was something in Evelyn's eyes that stirred a strange flicker of recognition. She wondered if Evelyn had ever thought of her, if the woman who had given her life had ever regretted abandoning her. That afternoon, Lana mustered the courage to speak with her supervisor, Julia, a senior partner at Parker & Finch, who had always treated her with kindness. She requested a private meeting, her voice steady but strained. Julia agreed, sensing the urgency in Lana's tone. As Lana sat across from Julia in her office, she took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Julia, there's something you need to know about the Marshall case. It's personal." Julia's brow furrowed and she leaned forward. "Lana, whatever it is, you can tell me." Lana hesitated, but she knew there was no turning back. "I found something in my adoption records last night, something that connects me to Robert and Evelyn Marshall. They're my biological parents." The room fell silent as Julia absorbed the revelation, her expression shifting from shock to understanding. "Lana, I had no idea. Are you absolutely sure?" Lana nodded, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes. I've seen the birth certificate. It's undeniable." Julia let out a slow breath, studying Lana with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "This certainly complicates things, but if you feel the need to step back from the case, I can make arrangements." Lana shook her head. "No. I need to see this through. I want answers, Julia. I want to understand why they left me." Julia nodded slowly, a look of respect crossing her face. "I understand, but Lana, if at any point you feel overwhelmed, you must let me know. This isn't just any case for you." "I know," Lana replied, her voice firm, "but I need this. I've spent my whole life wondering who I am, why I was abandoned. This is my chance to finally find out." Julia reached across the desk, placing a comforting hand on Lana's. "Then I'll support you, whatever you decide. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself in the process." Lana managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Julia. I'll be careful." As she left Julia's office, Lana felt a renewed sense of determination. She would face the Marshalls not just as a paralegal but as their daughter, the child they had left behind, now returned to uncover the truth. And as the case continued, she would unravel the web of lies and betrayals that had defined her life, no matter how painful it might be. In the days that followed, Lana delved deeper into the Marshall family's history, gathering evidence, connecting dots, and building a case that was as much about her own journey as it was about legal justice. With every document she uncovered, every testimony she prepared, she felt herself growing stronger, her resolve hardening. She would no longer be a victim of her past, a forgotten child lurking in the shadows. The court sessions continued, but now Lana saw the Marshalls with new eyes. They were no longer just clients. They were the architects of her past, the silent figures who had haunted her life. And as she prepared to confront them, she knew that the answers she sought were close, waiting to be revealed in the courtroom where her own truth would finally come to light.
The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as another day of the Marshall case began. Lana sat at her usual spot at the Parker and Finch table, clutching her notepad, with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. She had reached her breaking point. Every day she faced Robert and Evelyn in court. Every unacknowledged glance had pushed her closer to the edge. And now, as she looked across the room at the people who had brought her into the world only to abandon her, she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. The trial was tense, steeped in accusations and heated exchanges. Samantha's attorney questioned Robert about certain transactions within the family business, withdrawals, missing funds, hidden accounts, all carefully concealed and meticulously orchestrated. As Robert spoke, Lana noticed his calm, almost rehearsed way of deflecting questions and shifting blame. It was a mask she had come to know well. Yet, knowing this man was her father stirred something fierce within her. At one point, As Robert's testimony continued, she could no longer hold back. The words rose within her, an unstoppable force that refused to be contained. She stood, her voice cutting through the murmurs in the courtroom. "I can't listen to this any longer," she said, her tone wavering with a mix of fury and pain. Her voice echoed through the room, and all eyes turned toward her. The judge looked up, startled. "Miss Adams, you are out of order. This is not your time to speak." Lana glanced at her supervising attorney, Julia, who gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Lana turned back to the judge, steadying her voice. "Your Honor," she said, "I have information directly relevant to this case, information that I can no longer keep to myself." The judge's gaze shifted, curiosity and caution in his eyes as he looked between Lana and the marshals, who appeared bewildered, their expressions a mix of surprise and unease. "Proceed," the judge said, his voice laced with an unspoken curiosity. Lana took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she looked directly at Robert and Evelyn, the people she had once considered strangers. The weight of the moment bore down on her, but she forced herself to speak. "My name is Lana Marie Marshall," she began, her voice trembling. "I was born to Robert and Evelyn Marshall, but shortly after my birth I was given up for adoption. For years I grew up in foster homes, never knowing my family, never understanding why I was abandoned." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Robert's face went pale, and Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Lana pressed on, fighting back tears. "I had no idea who my parents were until recently, when I found my birth certificate hidden among my adoption records. And it led me here, to this very courtroom, where I realized I'm representing my own parents in a case filled with lies and betrayal. The people I've been working with, the ones I thought were strangers, are my family." The silence in the courtroom was profound. Samantha's attorney looked stunned, his mouth slightly open, while Samantha seemed caught between shock and confusion. Robert and Evelyn, however, looked utterly shaken, their expressions betraying the truth they had buried for so long. "Is this true?" the judge asked, looking directly at Robert and Evelyn. Robert cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly, unable to meet Lana's gaze. "It's true. Lana is. She is our daughter." Murmurs filled the room as reporters scribbled notes glancing between Lana and the marshals. The judge tapped his gavel, calling for order, but the gravity of the revelation hung heavy in the air. Lana's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand firm, her gaze fixed on Robert and Evelyn. She wanted answers, needed them, and she wasn't backing down. "We?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Why did you abandon me? Why did you pretend I didn't exist?" Evelyn, who had been staring at her hands, finally looked up, her eyes filled with a painful mix of guilt and sorrow. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't that simple, Lana," Evelyn began, her voice cracking with emotion. "At the time, we were struggling. The business was on the brink of failure, our finances were falling apart, Robert's father had just passed, and there was immense pressure to keep the family's reputation intact. We were young and overwhelmed, and we didn't know what else to do." Robert swallowed, his gaze fixed on the floor. "We were scared, Lana," he said, his voice hoarse. "We thought, if we let you go, you'd have a chance at a better life. We thought we could rebuild, start over, and one day, maybe come back for you." Lana felt a surge of anger at his words. "Come back for me?" she echoed, incredulous. "You didn't come back. I spent my entire life in foster homes, wondering if I meant anything to anyone. And all this time you thought I'd have a better chance without you." Evelyn's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We made a terrible mistake, Lana, but we thought it was the only way to protect you from the chaos we were in." "But that's not the real truth, is it?" Samantha's voice cut through, cold and accusatory. She looked at Robert and Evelyn with a mix of disgust and satisfaction. "The truth is, you were more focused on saving face, on preserving the Marshall legacy, than on Lana's life." Robert's jaw tightened, and he turned toward Samantha, his voice low and defensive. "Samantha, you weren't there. You don't understand." "Maybe I wasn't," Samantha replied bitterly. "But I know what it's like to be discarded by you when I'm no longer useful to your perfect image. Do you think I don't know what happened to Lana? I found out years ago, and you made me swear to keep quiet. You saw her as a liability, a reminder of your failures." Lana's eyes widened as Samantha's words sank in. It felt as though the ground was slipping from beneath her, her sense of self unraveling under the weight of this truth. "Is that true?" Lana asked, her voice barely a whisper. She looked at Robert and Evelyn, her gaze piercing, demanding answers. "Did you really think of me as a liability?" Evelyn covered her face with her hands, unable to respond. But Robert's gaze remained steady, his eyes clouded with a mix of regret and defiance. "We thought we were doing what was best for you," he said, his tone strained. "We were young and frightened, and we made a choice. It was wrong, and we see that now. But at the time, we believed we were giving you a better chance." "A better chance?" Lana repeated, her voice cracking. "You abandoned me, left me to grow up without a family, without any explanation. I had no idea who I was, where I came from. Do you know what that does to a person?" Evelyn sobbed, shaking her head. "Lana, please, we know we were wrong. We were so wrong." The judge intervened, his voice gentle but firm. "Miss Adams, Miss Marshall, I understand this is a deeply personal revelation, but we must maintain order in this courtroom." Lana took a deep breath, her chest tight with anger and sadness. She looked back at the judge, nodding slowly, her mind reeling from the enormity of what had just unfolded. As the trial continued, the testimony took on a new dimension. Robert and Evelyn recounted the financial crisis that had consumed them, the intense pressure from their family, and the desperate decisions they had made to protect their image. It became clear that abandoning Lana wasn't solely about financial issues, but a calculated choice to prioritize their public image over their child. Lana sat through the rest of the trial, listening as her parents spoke about the regret that had haunted them over the years. But as they talked, she felt a sense of distance settle over her. Their words sounded hollow, their regret too little, too late. She had endured years of pain and loneliness, and no amount of explanation could undo the damage they had caused. By the end of the day, Lana was drained, emotionally exhausted. She could barely look at Robert and Evelyn as they left the courtroom, their heads bowed, faces lined with guilt and sorrow. As she gathered her belongings, Samantha approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Lana," she said softly, her voice tinged with sympathy. "I'm sorry. I know this is overwhelming, and I can't even imagine what you're going through, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Lana managed a weak smile, grateful for Samantha's support even as the pain of betrayal lingered. "Thank you, Samantha," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That night, as Lana lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the day's events over and over. She had finally confronted the truth about her past, had finally found the courage to face the parents who had abandoned her. But even now, with all the revelations laid bare, the wounds of her abandonment remained, raw and unresolved. She knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that healing would take time, and that the questions she still held might never find closure. But as she lay there, she realized that she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her own story, toward finally understanding who she was, and that, at least, was a start. The final day of the trial arrived, and Lana felt the tension simmering in the courtroom as everyone prepared for closing arguments. The past few days had been a whirlwind of revelations, emotions, and painful truths, leaving her feeling as though she were balancing on the edge of a cliff. Her biological parents, Robert and Evelyn, sat a few seats away, their expressions vacant, their faces etched with regret. Despite everything, an ache lingered within her, a small part that longed for some form of closure, perhaps even reconciliation. But the persistent anger reminded her of the years she'd spent alone, wondering why she had been left behind. As the proceedings began, the judge gave each party a final chance to address the court. Samantha's attorney spoke first, painting a stark picture of betrayal and greed that had torn the Marshall family apart. His words were sharp, his tone filled with conviction, and Lana saw Samantha nodding in agreement as he described how she had been neglected and ultimately discarded. He concluded his statement with a message on family loyalty and the painful consequences of forsaking those closest to you. Then it was Robert and Evelyn's turn. Their attorney spoke on their behalf, but his tone was subdued. He admitted mistakes had been made but emphasized the couple's regret and the years they had spent grappling with their choices. The words were carefully chosen, yet Lana found no solace in them. Regret was easily spoken after the damage was already done. The judge turned his attention to Lana, his gaze softening. "Miss Adams, I understand that you've been profoundly impacted by these revelations. As a member of this case, you may address the court before we conclude, if you wish." Lana's heart raced as she rose from her seat. She hadn't planned on speaking, but this felt like an opportunity to release what she'd held inside for so many years. She walked to the front of the courtroom, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the room. Every emotion she'd buried seemed to rise within her, ready to pour out. Taking a steadying breath, she began, her voice low but steady. "When I was a child, I spent countless nights lying awake, wondering why I wasn't wanted. I moved from one foster home to another, always hoping that maybe the next place would feel like a real home. And each time I packed my things and left, each time I had to say goodbye to people who weren't really family, it felt like losing a piece of myself." She paused, letting her words sink in. She saw Evelyn bow her head, her hands clenching as if to shield herself from the truth in Lana's words. Every birthday, every holiday, every moment that should have felt filled with love was marked by emptiness. I grew up believing that I wasn't good enough, that something was wrong with me because I was abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect me. And now, standing here today, I realize those scars will never fully heal. Robert shifted uncomfortably, his face tense. Lana met his gaze, her own fierce. "You left me," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You made a choice, and that choice changed my life forever. And it wasn't just about financial problems or family reputation. It was about deciding I wasn't worth fighting for. You were willing to erase me from your lives as if I had never existed." Evelyn let out a choked sob, but Lana stood firm, refusing to let emotion soften her message. "I don't doubt that you regret what you did," she continued, her tone softening just slightly. "Maybe a part of you wishes things could have been different, but regret doesn't erase years of pain. Years I spent wondering who I was and where I belonged. And it doesn't give me back the family I should have had." Her voice wavered as she continued. "Growing up, I learned that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by the people who show up, who stay by your side even when things get hard. It's defined by love and support, not the names on a birth certificate. I had to learn that the hard way, and while I wish things could have been different, I can't change the past. I can only decide how to move forward." Lana took a deep breath, looking down at her hands as she gathered her thoughts. She knew the words she was about to say would close this chapter of her life for good, but she was ready. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, "but I can't carry this anger with me forever. I've spent my life surviving without you, and I've built something strong and beautiful from that survival. I've created my own family, my own support, and that's enough for me." She looked at Robert and Evelyn one last time, her eyes reflecting quiet strength. "I'm choosing to walk away from this, not because I don't care, but because I deserve peace. I deserve to live my life without the weight of what you did to me." With that, she returned to her seat, her heart pounding, but her spirit feeling lighter. She had said what needed to be said, had finally confronted the shadows that had haunted her for so long. There was no going back, but that was okay. She didn't need to look back. Her life awaited her beyond the walls of this courtroom. The judge nodded solemnly, acknowledging the gravity of Lana's words. "Thank you, Miss Adams," he said, his voice filled with respect. He then addressed the courtroom, bringing the trial to a close with a few final remarks. But Lana's mind had already drifted elsewhere, her thoughts on the life she was ready to embrace. As people began to file out of the courtroom, Robert and Evelyn approached her, their faces etched with regret and sadness. Evelyn reached out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lana, we're sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but please know that we're truly sorry." Lana looked at them, feeling a blend of sadness and release. She could see the pain in their eyes, could sense the burden they carried. But she also knew she couldn't let their guilt dictate her future. "I know you are," she said softly, "and maybe, someday, that will mean something more to me. But right now, I need to move forward. I need to live my life." Robert nodded, his expression somber. "We understand." Without another word, they turned and walked away, leaving Lana alone. She watched them go, feeling an unexpected sense of peace settle over her. The past would always be a part of her, but it didn't have to define her future. She had the strength, resilience, and freedom to write her own story now. As she stepped out of the courthouse and into the fresh air, Lana felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had spent her life searching for answers, searching for a sense of belonging. But standing there, bathed in the warmth of the afternoon sun, she realized that she had always belonged to herself. She was enough, just as she was. For the first time in years, Lana felt truly free. The scars of her past remained, but they no longer held her captive. She was ready to face the world, ready to build a life defined by love, resilience, and the family she had chosen. With one last look at the courthouse, Lana turned and walked away, her heart filled with the certainty that she was no longer bound by her past. Her future was hers to shape, hers to create, and she embraced it with open arms, ready to live a life that was truly her own.